I've made a lot of videos on great games, from NFL 2K5 to Madden 08 to NBA 2K11 to the NASCAR Thunder Series to College Hoops 2K8. Making videos about all-time classic sports games is a staple of my channel. That's why when I say that MVP Baseball 2005 might just be the best out of all of them, you should take notice. It's easily the greatest baseball game of all time, but honestly, it might just be the greatest sports game of all time. MVP Baseball 2005 was an incredible achievement, ahead of its time, simple yet complex. The soundtrack was probably your favorite when the game came out and is still a guilty pleasure today. The minigames, John Dowd, the innovative pitch meter, the color-coded pitches, the legitimately deep dynasty mode, the minor league rosters, the hitting game, the replay system. There's a lot to talk about with this game, and I'm surprised I took so long to get to it. I have no idea how they did it, but EA Sports 2004 to 2005 lineup of games were god tier. NBA Live 05, Madden 05, NASCAR 05, NHL 05, FIFA 05, and even Tiger Woods PGA Tour 05. They were all amazing. In February of 2005, EA capped off their 05 lineup with their greatest game yet, MVP Baseball 2005. The game is currently in IGN's Reader's Choice Top 100 Games of All Time. Not best sports games of all time, but best video games in general of all time. So what made MVP Baseball so good? I think a better question is, what didn't make MVP Baseball good? The game had everything you'd want from a sports game, a super deep dynasty mode that let users play for 120 seasons, including spring training each year. Team chemistry, player moods, team rivalries, and minor league farming were all major parts of the dynasty mode. The game also had an owner mode, giving players more freedom over their team, allowing them to create and design their own ballpark, manage concession prices, hire a full team staff, and more. The soundtrack had a ton of licensed music that was energetic and made by popular artists at the time. The Hitter's Eye feature was a game changer in real time. Seeing what type of pitch was coming at you and adjusting to it is nearly impossible. It's why elite hitters are so few and far between in the MLB. This feature made the game easier to play, as different pitches were color-coded based on the pitch type, and left a trail as it left the pitcher's hand. In previous versions of MVP Baseball, it was incredibly difficult to see what type of pitch was coming, and this new feature was very well received. Mini-games were added to 05, including a super addicting ramp-hitting batting minigame. These were very similar to the awesome mini-camp drills in older Madden games. The game allowed managers to argue with umpires at any time, including ejections for arguing about balls or strikes, and sometimes arguing would actually work, as the umpires were dynamic and could make some inaccurate calls. And after every pitch, a slow-motion overhead replay is shown to give players feedback on their pitch or hit to help them adjust and improve. In the Dynasty and Owners mode, games could be rained out, causing a doubleheader. The game features minor league teams and rosters which are playable anytime. The rosters weren't fully filled, however, so there were some generic players. Speaking of generic players, there was the famous John Dowd. He was incredibly overpowered because he was technically Barry Bonds. EA didn't have the rights to use Barry Bonds, so they created a generic player with the exact same attributes instead. Over time, people have fallen in love with the fictitious monster of a player. The gameplay itself was incredible, and unlike a lot of other sports games, it doesn't feel outdated today. Coming from the show, MVP 05 doesn't feel like a downgrade, besides the lower resolution graphics. The hitting and pitching is fair and doesn't feel as random. The game was a big improvement over the 2004 version, as many issues such as pitching being too easy or the inability to hit well with a lefty were all fixed. Perhaps because this was EA's final baseball game, they went all out. The Hitter's Eye feature is dynamic, as the color of the pitch is more visible to higher rated batters. Lower rated batters only get a quick glimpse of what type of pitch is coming. Pitchers who cover up the ball during their windup will hide the color for longer, making it more difficult for the batters to predict the pitch. The game also included in-depth sliders for game tuning, allowing the player to fine-tune the gameplay to their liking. There really isn't anything I can find to complain about with the game's gameplay. It feels rock solid and as good as a baseball video game could be. And most importantly, it's fun. I think the minigames deserve more attention. They were amazing, and you could spend days on end playing them. I also think they were a great addition for players new to baseball who would get overwhelmed in the owner or dynasty mode and want to practice the basics of the game. In the hitting minigame, The player tries to hit a set number of pitches, and an arrow pops up before delivery showing the player how and where to hit the ball. There are ramps you try to hit, and other objects in the distance you can get bonus points for hitting. It's very addicting. The pitching minigame is all about accuracy. You try to hit different zones with a specific pitch shown to you, and getting the correct pitch will cause the ball to knock down panels. IGN called it Tetris Baseball in their review of the game. It was brilliant. While the game's graphics don't look great today, especially not in 480p, it still holds up, and when played on a PC or emulated in higher resolution, it looks great. The animations were excellent, especially for throwing, catching, and fielding. The double plays in particular looked great. And for such an old game, the players' faces actually looked pretty good and realistic, despite the game using such a low poly count. The game's sound is phenomenal as well. The crack of the bat against the ball is perfect, along with the slap of the ball into the mitt. The commentary team was excellent as well. MVP Baseball 05 was simply perfect. I've never played such a flawless sports game. And I'm not even that big of a baseball guy, but it's simply more fun than a lot of other sports games. EA knocked it out of the park, pun intended. As I mentioned earlier, this was the last MLB game made by EA. In response to EA signing an exclusive rights agreement with the NFL, 2K signed an exclusive rights agreement with the MLB. And while at the time, 2K baseball games were pretty good, they weren't as good as EA's, and they only got worse. The next 7 years were filled with bad 2K baseball games. EA continued making the MVP Baseball series only with college teams instead of MLB teams. 2 years later, EA was done. They said publicly that they love baseball and would be happy to make baseball games again, but complications from using a modern engine and a focus on their other sports titles has made it unrealistic for the time being. When 2K's exclusive rights were up in 2012, MLB The Show became the flagship MLB video game, and while the show games have been pretty decent, none have had the same level of fan and critical acclaim as MVP Baseball 2005. Today, MLB The Show 20 is a decent game, but it has a lot of issues, and the game's franchise mode is still behind EA's from 2005. I'd say for a sports game, the show is definitely better than anything EA has put out recently, but it still has room to improve before we start calling it great. The hitting is too random, the game lacks depth, while simultaneously being tedious, and the lack of a true online franchise mode is a bummer. It also suffers from the same constant patching problems every other modern sports game deals with. One day, the gameplay is fine, and the next day a patch rolls in to ruin everything. I will say that Diamond Dynasty is the best and most fair Ultimate Team type of mode in any major sports game, however. Today, MVP Baseball 2005 is held in high esteem, and for good reason. The game was amazing for its time, and even today, it still plays better than any other baseball game ever made before it or after it. It's crazy how good sports games were in the early to mid 2000s. Like every other great sports game, the community is still updating the rosters of MVP Baseball 2005, allowing the game to live on. If you haven't played it yet, you really should. Thanks for watching.